Picture this: you're standing atop the towering walls of an ancient city, the air thick with tension as an enemy army gathers in the distance. But before the first arrow flies or sword is drawn, another weapon cuts through the silence: the relentless beat of war drums, the eerie wail of horns, the rhythmic chants of soldiers. This wasn't just noise, it was warfare. Long before modern technology, armies wielded music as a psychological weapon, capable of shattering enemy morale or uniting their own forces with a single, thunderous rhythm. Today, we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover the hidden symphony of siege warfare, where melodies and rhythms were as vital as swords and shields. Think about the power of music in your own life, how a song can lift your spirits, bring tears to your eyes, or even fill you with energy. Now imagine that same power amplified across a battlefield, where the right tune could mean the difference between victory and defeat. From the disciplined legions of Rome, who marched to the precise blows of their drums, to the Mongols, whose terrifying horn blasts sent chills down the spines of their enemies, music was a tool of intimidation, coordination, and even deception. It wasn't just background noise, it was a calculated strategy designed to unsettle, inspire, or mislead. But how did ancient commanders harness this invisible force? And why does it still matter today? Over the next few minutes, we'll journey through time to explore the secret role of music in some of history's most pivotal sieges. You'll discover how melodies were used to send coded messages, how rhythms could manipulate the perception of time, and how the absence of sound could be just as powerful as its presence. By the end, you'll hear music and silence in a whole new way. So let's step onto the battlefield where every note carried the weight of destiny and uncover the hidden harmonies of war. The roar of war drums wasn't just noise, it was a weapon of mass disruption. Ancient commanders knew that sound could travel farther than any arrow, and they wielded it with precision. Take the Assyrians, for example, whose armies marched to the relentless thunder of bronze drums, a sound so deep it vibrated through the ground. Defenders on city walls wouldn't just hear the approaching army, they'd feel it in their bones, a physical reminder of the overwhelming force about to crash against their gates. Then there were the Celtic Carnixes, towering horns shaped like snarling beasts. When blown in unison, their eerie, dissonant cries mimicked the howls of a supernatural army, playing on the deepest superstitions of their enemies. But sound wasn't just about fear, it was about control. The Roman legions moved as one because every step was dictated by the beat of their drummers. A steady rhythm kept soldiers in perfect sync, turning thousands of individuals into a single, unstoppable machine. Lose that rhythm and chaos could spread faster than any rumor of defeat. That's why silencing an enemy's musicians was often a priority in battle. Without their drums or horns, an army could lose its coordination, its momentum, even its nerve. And then there were the tricks, the sonic illusions. Some generals ordered their musicians to play through the night, not just to keep their own troops alert, but to make the enemy believe their forces were larger or closer than they truly were. Imagine standing guard in the dark, listening to what sounds like an endless sea of drums and horns just beyond the torchlight. How many defenders, exhausted by sleepless nights of imagined threats, surrendered simply because their minds had been worn down by sound? Music wasn't just part of the battle, it was the battle long before swords ever crossed. Drums didn't just keep time, they shaped reality on the battlefield. Imagine the sheer psychological force of an approaching army whose footsteps matched the pounding of massive war drums. each beat echoing like the heartbeat of some colossal beast. The Assyrians mastered this art, crafting drums so large they required multiple men to carry them, their deep, resonant booms vibrating through the earth itself. To defenders huddled behind city walls, that sound wasn't just a warning, it was a visceral threat, a reminder that the enemy wasn't just near, but everywhere, their presence magnified by the relentless rhythm. The Spartans took a different approach, pairing drums with the piercing melodies of flutes. While other armies relied on brute noise, the Spartans turned warfare into a grim symphony. Their soldiers moved in perfect lockstep, not just to the beat of drums, but to the eerie, disciplined notes of wind instruments. This wasn't just about coordination, it was about control. The music stripped away individual hesitation, turning each warrior into a single cog in an unstoppable machine. Opponents facing the Spartans didn't just see a wall of shields, they heard the chilling precision of an army that moved as one, a sound as terrifying as any battle cry. But the most cunning commanders used drums to deceive. By spacing out their drummers and varying the intensity of their beats, they could make a small force sound like an endless tide. Picture a scout listening from a distant hill, counting the rhythms and reporting back that the enemy's numbers were far greater than they truly were. Fear did the rest. Armies would retreat, cities would surrender, all because of the illusion woven by sound, and when the drums suddenly fell silent. That was its own kind of weapon. The absence of rhythm left enemies straining to hear, their minds racing with uncertainty. Was the attack coming? Had they been flanked? In the chaos of war, silence could be louder than any drum. What's fascinating is how these ancient tactics still echo today. Modern militaries may not march to flutes or drums, but the principles remain. Sound shapes morale, coordination, and perception. The next time you hear a steady, pounding rhythm, think of the armies that once moved to it and how something as simple as a beat could change the course of history. Trumpets and horns didn't just make noise, they carved fear into the hearts of those who heard them. The Roman tuba, a long, straight bronze instrument, wasn't the melodic device we think of today. Its sharp, blaring notes cut through the chaos of battle, signaling everything from retreats to all-out assaults. But it wasn't just about orders, it was about psychology. Imagine being a defender on a city wall, hearing that unmistakable sound ripple through the enemy ranks. In an instant, you'd know the attack was coming. And that moment of realization, that split second of dread, was exactly what commanders aimed to exploit. The Celtic Carnix took this terror to another level. Standing taller than a man with its boar-shaped bell screaming into the wind, it wasn't just an instrument, it was a spectacle. Ancient writers described its sound as otherworldly, like the shrieks of vengeful spirits. When hundreds of these horns sounded at once, the effect wasn't just loud, it was paralyzing. Defenders already on edge from days of siege would hear that chorus and feel their resolve crumble. It wasn't just noise, it was theater designed to make the enemy feel outnumbered, outmatched, and utterly doomed before the first soldier even scaled the walls. But the real genius lay in how these sounds were choreographed. The Romans didn't just blast their trumpets randomly, each call had a purpose. One sequence might signal archers to ready their volleys, while another told siege towers to advance. This wasn't just communication, it was synchronization, turning chaos into order. Picture a massive battering ram rolling toward a gate. Without a single visible signal, the crew would strike in perfect unison, their timing dictated by the blare of a horn. The defenders, meanwhile, heard only the relentless calls echoing around them, never knowing where the next blow would land. That uncertainty was part of the weapon. And then there was silence. After hours of relentless trumpet blasts, a sudden hush could be just as unnerving. Defenders would strain their ears, wondering if the enemy was regrouping, tunneling beneath them, or preparing some unseen catastrophe. The absence of sound became its own kind of psychological warfare, leaving minds to fill the void with every possible fear. Modern militaries still use sound and silence as tools. Think of the sirens before an airstrike, or the eerie quiet before an ambush. The technology has changed, but the principle remains: control what your enemy hears, and you control how they think. What's striking is how these ancient instruments blurred the line between tool and terror. A trumpet wasn't just a trumpet, it was a herald of fate, a sound that could turn disciplined soldiers into a fleeing mob or rally a broken line with a single note. The next time you hear a brass instrument, listen closely. That note echoing through the air carries centuries of history, a reminder that music isn't just art, it's power. Chants and battle cries transformed human voices into instruments of war, turning raw sound into an avalanche of terror. Picture the moment before a Viking charge, the air thick with tension as warriors began pounding their shields in unison, a deafening wall of noise building with each thunderous clash. But it wasn't just the sound that shook their enemies, it was the ritual. The Vikings would chant in a hypnotic rhythm, voices rising together like a storm, their words less important than the sheer force behind them. This wasn't just noise, it was a calculated display of unity and ferocity, designed to make opponents question whether they were facing men or something far more primal. Halfway across the world, the Maori warriors perfected their own version of sonic warfare, the haka. More than just a war cry, it was a full-body performance: stomping feet, rolling eyes, thrusting tongues, all synchronized to a thunderous chant. Every movement, every syllable was designed to unsettle. The haka wasn't merely about intimidation, it was a declaration of identity and resolve. Opponents didn't just hear the challenge, they saw it in the warriors' expressions, felt it in the vibrations of the earth beneath their feet. To stand against it was to stand against the spirit of an entire people, condensed into a single, electrifying moment. But these vocal tactics weren't just about fear, they were about transformation. When soldiers chanted together, something shifted in their own minds. The shared rhythm erased individual doubt, replacing it with a collective pulse of adrenaline and purpose. The Roman legions knew this well. Before battle, they'd shout their war cry in perfect unison, a single voice from thousands of throats. That moment of unity didn't just rattle the enemy, it bound the soldiers together, turning a group of men into a single, unstoppable force. The most cunning commanders took it further, weaponizing silence as much as sound. Imagine the eerie quiet just after a war cry faded, leaving defenders straining to hear what came next. Was the attack beginning? Were they already surrounded? That pause, that breathless uncertainty, could unravel discipline faster than any blade. Even today, echoes of these tactics linger, from the synchronized chants of modern sports teams to the cadence calls of military drills. The voices of ancient warriors still whisper through time, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't held in the hand, it's carried on the air. Imagine enduring night after night of relentless drumming, no sleep, no silence, just an unending barrage of sound shaking the walls of your city. This wasn't just harassment, it was siege warfare by another name. Ancient commanders understood that breaking an enemy's will required more than physical force, it demanded psychological erosion. The Mongols, those master strategists of the steppes, turned this tactic into an art form. Under cover of darkness, their musicians would unleash a cacophony of gongs, horns, and throat singing so dissonant it felt like the landscape itself was wailing. To defenders peering into the blackness, it created the illusion of an endless horde just beyond the torchlight. their numbers exaggerated by the echoes bouncing off the hills. But the real cruelty lay in the timing. Just as exhaustion began to drag at the eyelids of the watchmen, the music would stop, only to start again an hour later, unpredictable as a predator toying with its prey. Over days and weeks, the effect was devastating. Sleep deprivation blurred judgment, frayed nerves, and turned even the bravest soldiers into hollow-eyed shadows of themselves. Cities that could have held out for months under conventional siege would crack under the weight of relentless sound, their gates swinging open not because their walls had fallen, but because their minds had. The Romans used a subtler version of this tactic during their famous siege of Masada. Instead of constant noise, they employed rhythmic, synchronized hammering as their troops built siege works. The steady, metallic clang became a grim count, on each strike a reminder that the noose was tightening, that resistance was futile. Defenders couldn't ignore it, couldn't drown it out. Like a heartbeat counting down to doom, the sound seeped into every moment, turning time itself into an enemy. What's fascinating is how these ancient strategies mirror modern psychological operations. Today's militaries might use sirens, drones, or even white noise in place of war drums, but the principle remains unchanged. Control the soundscape, and you control the mind. The next time you struggle to focus because of a distant, repetitive noise, think of those ancient defenders on the walls. Their greatest battle wasn't against swords or arrows, it was against the invisible, inexorable power of sound. In the disciplined ranks of ancient armies, musicians weren't just background noise, they were the nervous system of the entire force. Take the Roman legions, where a single missed trumpet blast could mean the difference between a coordinated assault and deadly confusion. These musicians, known as cornicines and tubicines, weren't part-time performers dragged onto the battlefield. They were highly trained specialists, often drawn from the ranks of veteran soldiers. Their instruments weren't mere tools, they were lifelines capable of cutting through the roar of combat to deliver life or death commands. A short, sharp blast might signal archers to loose their arrows, while a sustained note could order cavalry to flank. Precision was everything. A single misplayed note could send the wrong unit charging into disaster. The stakes were so high that musicians occupied a unique space in military hierarchy. They held formal ranks, answered directly to commanders, and were often stationed near the general himself. Killing an enemy musician wasn't just an act of violence, it was a tactical masterstroke. Ancient accounts describe battles where entire formations unraveled after their trumpeters fell, leaving soldiers deaf to orders, stumbling blindly into chaos. The Assyrians took this even further, assigning bodyguards to shield their drummers during combat. These musicians weren't expendable, they were the glue holding the army together. Training these specialists was no simple feat. Roman military manuals describe grueling drills where musicians practiced complex sequences until they could play them flawlessly, blindfolded, in howling winds, even while wounded. The goal wasn't artistry, it was muscle memory. When blood fogged the air and screams drowned all else, these players had to react without thought, their fingers moving as instinctively as a soldier's parry. Some commands were so subtle they'd be lost on modern ears. A slight waver in pitch might tell spearmen to brace for cavalry, while a staccato triplet could warn of an ambush from the rear. What's remarkable is how these ancient systems mirror modern military communication. Today's radios and encrypted signals serve the same purpose as those bronze horns: clear, instant orders amid bedlam. But there's one key difference. Ancient musicians didn't just transmit commands, they embodied them. When soldiers heard their trumpets call, they weren't just following instructions, they were responding to a sound that had guided their comrades through 100 battles, a note that carried the weight of tradition and trust. That's why losing a musician struck deeper than losing a weapon. It wasn't just a tool gone silent, it was the voice of the legion itself, suddenly snuffed out. Yet for all their skill, these musicians faced a grim paradox. The better they performed their duty, the more they became targets. Some accounts describe enemy archers loosing volleys specifically at the glint of brass instruments, knowing that felling one could doom hundreds. It's a testament to their courage that so many stood their ground, playing on even as arrows thudded into shields around them. Their legacy isn't just in the battles they helped win, but in the unbroken chain of discipline they represented, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a blade, but a breath of air shaped into sound. When the priests of Israel marched around Jericho blowing their sacred trumpets, they weren't just making noise, they were channeling what they believed was the voice of God Himself. According to the ancient texts, the walls didn't collapse from brute force, but from the sheer power of faith amplified by sound. This story captures a truth that echoed across countless battlefields. Music wasn't just a tool of war, it was a bridge to the divine. In cultures from the Nile to the Euphrates, armies didn't merely play instruments, they performed rituals, transforming every note into a prayer for victory. The Egyptians took this belief to extraordinary lengths. Before battle, their military bands would play hymns dedicated to gods like Ra or Sekhmet, the lioness warrior. These weren't casual performances, they were elaborate ceremonies with priests and musicians working in tandem to invoke celestial favor. Imagine the scene, thousands of soldiers kneeling as haunting melodies drifted over the sands, each note carefully chosen to align with sacred texts. To these warriors, the music wasn't just inspiring, it was a literal shield, a promise that the gods marched beside them. And when the army advanced, their hymns shifted into rhythmic chants, turning religious fervor into battlefield momentum. But the power of these rituals went deeper than mere inspiration. They tapped into something primal, the human need to believe in forces greater than oneself. A soldier who thought his trumpet blast could summon divine intervention fought differently than one relying solely on his sword arm. The Assyrians understood this perfectly. Their war drums weren't just instruments, they were said to be blessed by Ishtar, goddess of war. When those drums thundered, troops didn't just hear a beat, they felt the presence of a deity urging them forward. Defenders facing them didn't just fear an army, they feared the wrath of the gods themselves. This psychological edge was carefully cultivated. In India, the vibrations of conch shells blown before battle were believed to purify the air and strike fear into demonic forces. Greek armies invoked Apollo with lyres and flutes, their melodies designed to mirror the harmony of the cosmos. Even the Celts, with their wild Carnix blasts, wove spiritual significance into every note, claiming the sounds could open portals to the other world. The message was universal. This wasn't just music, it was destiny itself played aloud. What's striking is how these beliefs crossed continents and eras. Whether it was the Hebrew shofar or the Aztec death whistles, cultures with no contact shared the same instinct to weaponize faith through sound. Modern militaries may not invoke deities with bugle calls, but traces linger in traditions like the playing of taps or the bagpipes leading soldiers into battle. The instruments have changed, but the human need behind them remains, to transform fear into courage, chaos into order, and the mortal into something timeless. When those ancient musicians played, they weren't just fighting for land or loot, they were conducting the heavens themselves. The sea has its own rhythm, a vast, unpredictable pulse that ancient navies learned to harness through music. Picture a Greek trireme cutting through the waves, its three banks of oars rising and falling as one. That impossible synchronization didn't come from shouts or signals. It flowed from the hypnotic cadence of the Celts, the rowing master whose song dictated every stroke. These weren't just work songs, they were survival. A single oar out of time could tangle the entire ship, leaving it vulnerable to ramming. But when hundreds of rowers moved as a single organism, guided by the rise and fall of their leader's voice, the trireme became a weapon of terrifying precision. The songs themselves were simple repetitive chants about home or heroes, but their power was anything but. They turned exhaustion into endurance, individual effort into collective force. Now imagine the opposite effect the moment those rhythms reached shore. For coastal towns, the first warning of attack often wasn't the sight of sails, but the sound of drums echoing across the water. Viking longships mastered this psychological warfare. As they neared a settlement, their rowers would switch from steady paddling to thunderous, synchronized drumbeats, the hulls amplifying the noise like some monstrous heartbeat. By the time the ships slid into view, defenders were already unnerved, their minds racing with stories of dragon-proud nightmares. Some towns, hearing that relentless percussion from afar, flung open their gates and offered tribute before a single axe was raised. Why risk annihilation when the sound alone told you resistance was futile? But naval music wasn't just about fear, it was about deception. Carthaginian admirals would sometimes order their fleets to row in silence, only to erupt with sudden blasts of trumpets and shouts at the last moment, creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving. The shock could scatter enemy formations without a single ship ramming another. Similarly, Byzantine dromons used hydraulic organs, massive, steam-powered instruments, to project eerie, resonant tones across the waves. To opposing crews, it sounded like the sea itself was groaning, a supernatural omen meant to sap their resolve. The most ingenious tactic, though, belonged to the Chinese admiral Zheng He, whose treasure fleet included entire boats dedicated to music. As his armada approached hostile ports, these floating bands would play serene, almost ceremonial melodies, a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of war. The effect was deeply unsettling. Defenders expecting violence found themselves disarmed by the incongruous beauty, their tension giving way to confusion. By the time they realized it was a ruse, Zheng He's troops were already ashore. What's remarkable is how these ancient naval strategies mirror modern psychological operations. Today's sonar pings and underwater acoustic devices serve the same purpose as those rowing chants and war drums: to dominate the soundscape, to unsettle, to control. The next time you hear the rhythmic lapping of waves, listen closer. Beneath that natural melody lies an older truth. The sea doesn't just carry ships, it carries sound, and sound has always been the unseen current of power. There's something far more unsettling than the roar of battle the moment it stops. The Spartans understood this better than anyone. While most armies relied on the deafening clamor of war to intimidate, Sparta's warriors perfected the art of silence. Imagine standing on the walls of a besieged city, straining your ears for the usual drumbeats and war cries, only to hear nothing but the wind. No warning, no cues, just the creeping dread of an invisible threat. That silence wasn't an accident, it was a blade honed to slice through the nerves of even the most seasoned defenders. This tactic played on a primal human instinct, our fear of the unseen. When noise fills the air, the mind latches onto it, processes it, prepares for it. But silence leaves room for imagination to run wild. Are they tunneling beneath the walls? Have they already scaled them in the dark? The Spartans weaponized that uncertainty. Their soldiers would advance without a single shout or clatter of armor, moving like shadows under the moon. By the time defenders spotted them, it was often too late. The absence of sound had already done its work, paralyzing sentries with doubt until the moment cold steel proved their fears right. Other cultures took this even further. The ninja of feudal Japan turned silence into an entire philosophy of warfare. Their stealth wasn't just about avoiding detection, it was about crafting an aura of inevitability. Villagers would report whispers in the night, fleeting shadows, then wake to find their gatekeepers dead without a single alarm raised. The message was clear: resistance was pointless when your enemy could vanish into the air itself. But silence wasn't just for stealth, it could be theatrical. The Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, would sometimes halt their usual barrage of drums and horns mid-siege. For hours, even days, the only sound outside the walls would be the occasional whinny of a horse or the creak of siege engines shifting in the wind. Then, without warning, a single arrow would streak over the ramparts, followed by a sudden, deafening onslaught of noise and motion. That calculated pause wasn't just rest, it was a trap. Defenders who let their guard down during the lull found themselves overwhelmed when the storm finally broke. What's fascinating is how this ancient tactic mirrors modern warfare. Today's special forces train extensively in noise discipline, understanding that the quiet before an ambush can be just as devastating as the gunfire that follows. Even in nature, predators know the value of silence the way a lion's paws make no sound until the final pounce. That instinctual response to quiet danger is hardwired into us, a relic of nights spent listening for threats in the dark. The Spartans didn't invent fear, they simply understood how to let it grow in the spaces between sounds. So the next time you find yourself in utter stillness, pay attention to that prickle on your neck. Centuries of warfare whisper that silence isn't empty, it's full of possibility. The battlefield wasn't just filled with the clang of metal and the shouts of soldiers. Sometimes, the most terrifying sounds came from creatures that never held a weapon. Ancient commanders didn't just rely on human-made noise, they harnessed the raw, primal power of animals to shatter enemy morale. Take the Carthaginians, who turned the lowing of cattle into a weapon. During one legendary siege, they tied flaming brands to the horns of herds and drove them toward enemy lines under cover of darkness. The result, a stampede of panicked animals, their agonized bellows mingling with the thunder of hooves and the crackle of fire. To defenders peering into the night, it must have seemed like the earth itself was screaming, a wall of sound and flame barreling toward them with no army in sight. The chaos wasn't just physical, it was psychological, turning the familiar sounds of livestock into something monstrous and unnatural. Then there were the elephants, nature's own war machines. Their sheer size was terrifying enough, but it was their voices that truly unnerved opponents. An elephant's roar isn't just loud, it's visceral, a deep, resonant blast that vibrates through the chest. Ancient Indian armies would line up dozens of these giants before battle, their collective trumpeting echoing for miles. To enemies unfamiliar with the sound, it was like hearing dragons awaken. The Macedonians, facing war elephants for the first time, described the noise as the rending of the earth, a sound so alien it sent seasoned soldiers scrambling before the beasts even charged. But the cleverest use of animal sounds wasn't about volume, it was about deception. The Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, would sometimes tether drums to the saddles of horses and let them gallop in circles around a besieged city at night. The erratic, thundering rhythm created the illusion of an endless cavalry, their numbers magnified by the darkness and the animals' frenzied movement. Defenders would waste precious arrows firing at shadows, their nerves fraying with every passing hour. Other armies released flocks of birds with shrieking whistles tied to their feet, filling the sky with unnatural cries that seemed to foretell doom. What's striking is how these tactics played on deep-seated instincts. Humans are wired to react to animal sounds, a lion's growl, a wolf's howl, with primal fear. By weaponizing those sounds, commanders tapped into something older than strategy, older than civilization itself. Today, we might not use stampeding cattle or trumpeting elephants in warfare, but the principle survives. Modern militaries still study the psychology of sound, understanding that terror isn't just about what you see, it's about what you hear in the dark, when your mind races to fill the silence. So the next time you hear an animal's cry in the distance, remember, centuries ago, that same sound might have sent an entire army running. Alexander the Great didn't just conquer with swords and spears, he won battles with echoes. One of his most cunning tactics involved scattering his musicians across the battlefield, their drums and trumpets spaced just far enough apart to create a sonic illusion. To defenders listening from city walls, the overlapping rhythms and blaring horns didn't sound like a single army. They sounded like multiple forces converging from all directions. The effect was psychological warfare at its finest. A garrison expecting to face a few thousand soldiers might hear what seemed like tens of thousands, their confidence crumbling before the first arrow was even loosed. But Alexander wasn't alone in this deception. The Roman general Scipio Africanus pulled a similar trick during the Second Punic War. Facing a numerically superior Carthaginian force, he ordered his trumpeters to circle behind enemy lines under cover of darkness. At dawn, when the Carthaginians awoke to the sound of Roman battle calls emanating from what should have been their own rear, panic spread like wildfire. The mere suggestion of being surrounded was enough to fracture their discipline, turning a potential defeat into one of Rome's most storied victories. The secret to these illusions wasn't just volume, it was acoustics. Ancient commanders understood how sound behaves in open terrain, bouncing off hills and valleys to create phantom echoes. The Mongols took this further, timing their drumbeats to coincide with natural wind gusts, making their numbers seem to swell and fade like ghosts in the steppe. Defenders couldn't trust their own ears, left to wonder if the enemy was advancing or retreating, near or far. Perhaps the most chilling twist came from the Byzantines, who added visual deception to the mix. During night sieges, they'd position musicians behind rows of torches spaced far apart. The flickering light made it impossible to gauge distances accurately, while the music seemed to originate from everywhere at once. To observers on the walls, it looked and sounded like an endless sea of fire and sound advancing toward them. Some cities surrendered purely because their sentries swore they saw the horizon itself moving. What's fascinating is how these ancient tactics exploited a universal human weakness, our reliance on sound to interpret threats. Modern armies still use similar principles today. Think of helicopter loudspeakers projecting voices in war zones, or drones emitting eerie frequencies to unsettle enemies. The technology has evolved, but the core strategy remains unchanged. When you can't outnumber your opponent, outsound them. The next time you hear an echo in the mountains, consider how easily sound can distort reality, and how many battles were won not by force, but by the clever manipulation of a single reverberating note. Low-frequency drumbeats don't just vibrate through the air, they resonate deep within the human nervous system. Modern research reveals that sounds below 120 Hz, like those produced by massive war drums, trigger a physiological response known as infrasound. These frequencies are too low for the ear to fully process, but the body feels them as a primal warning, a subconscious signal of approaching danger. Ancient armies may not have known the science, but they didn't need to. When Assyrian drummers pounded their 6-foot-wide instruments, the resulting waves didn't just reach defenders' ears, they traveled through the ground, up through the soles of their feet, and into the pit of their stomachs. That queasy, unsettling sensation wasn't just fear, it was biology. The same instinct that makes modern humans uneasy during thunderstorms or earthquakes was weaponized millennia ago, turning rhythm into a tool of psychological domination. But it wasn't just the bass tones that worked. Sudden, sharp noises like the blare of a Celtic Carnix or the crack of a whip activate the amygdala, the brain's alarm center. Studies show these sounds cause a measurable spike in cortisol, the stress hormone, within milliseconds. Picture a Roman tuba cutting through the chaos of battle with a single piercing note. To a defender already on edge, that sound wasn't just a signal, it was a shockwave, triggering the same fight or flight response as a predator's growl. Ancient commanders exploited this reflex brilliantly, timing their loudest blasts for moments when enemies were most vulnerable, like the eerie quiet before a siege tower's ramp dropped. The result, defenders often flinched, hesitated, or broke formation purely because their bodies reacted faster than their minds could override. The universality of these effects explains why cultures separated by oceans and centuries arrived at similar sonic strategies. From the Maori haka's staccato shouts to the Ottoman Meta band's crashing cymbals, the same principles emerge. Rhythmic repetition creates tension, while dissonance notes that clash unnaturally heightens unease. Modern film composers use identical techniques, layering low drones and jarring strings to manipulate audiences' emotions. The fact that these methods work across time and medium isn't coincidence, it's neuroscience. Our brains are wired to interpret certain sound patterns as threats, a legacy from when survival depended on reading the environment's audio cues. What's remarkable is how precisely ancient musicians refined their craft without modern tools. The Mongols' throat singing, for instance, produces overlapping tones that modern studies confirm induce disorientation. The Greeks tuned their olos pipes to intervals now known to create auditory conflict in the brain. These weren't random choices, they were the results of centuries of trial and error, honed until the sounds produced the exact psychological effect commanders desired. Today, we might use decibel meters and frequency analyzers to achieve the same results, but the goal remains unchanged: to bypass reason and speak directly to the primal mind. Perhaps the most chilling revelation is how these ancient tactics mirror modern non-lethal weapons. Sonic cannons used for crowd control operate on the same infrasound principles as those Assyrian drums. The Sound of Doom, played during the Siege of Panama in 1989, borrowed from the same psychological playbook as Viking war chants. The technology has advanced, but the target, the human nervous system, hasn't changed. When you hear a deep bass note that makes your chest tighten or a sudden scream that jolts you upright, you're experiencing the same responses that once decided the fates of empires. The next time music gives you chills, remember, those notes carry the weight of history, and your reaction is the echo of 1,000 battlefields. The Siege of Troy wasn't just about wooden horses and clashing swords, it was a battle of sound as much as steel. Ancient legends whisper of Trojan musicians playing haunting melodies from the walls, their lyres and flutes weaving through the chaos of war. Some accounts even suggest these eerie tunes were meant to unnerve the Greek besiegers, turning the city's defiance into something more unsettling, a reminder that even in the face of annihilation, Troy's spirit couldn't be silenced. Whether myth or reality, the story captures a profound truth. Music was the unseen defender atop those fabled walls, as vital as any shield or arrow. Half a world away, the Mongols took a far more brutal approach. When Genghis Khan's armies laid siege to a city, their drummers didn't just set a rhythm, they orchestrated terror. The relentless pounding of giant war drums, sometimes stretching for days without pause, wasn't just a prelude to attack, it was the attack. Defenders knew that when those drums finally stopped, the storm would break. The message was clear: Resistance was futile against an enemy who could weaponize time itself, turning the very air into a countdown to doom. But not all sonic warfare was about fear. At Masada, Jewish rebels used trumpets to defy the Roman siege in a different way. Perched high on their desert fortress, they blasted signals across the cliffs, coordinating defenses and rallying spirits in the face of impossible odds. The acoustics of the canyon amplified their calls, transforming simple brass instruments into lifelines. When silence finally fell over Masada, it wasn't because the trumpets had failed, it was because their players had chosen a final, defiant act of freedom. Medieval Europe refined music's role in sieges to an art form. Castle musicians weren't just entertainers, they were morale officers tasked with staving off despair during months-long blockades. Their repertoires were carefully curated hymns to bolster faith, lively dances to combat fatigue, even satirical songs mocking the enemy outside the gates. In some sieges, defenders would sing in unison, their voices rising over the walls as a challenge. "We're still here, still unbroken." The psychological duel was as critical as the physical one. A well-timed ballad could stiffen resolve more effectively than a barrel of arrows. What ties these stories together isn't just the presence of music, it's the recognition that war is fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. Whether it was the Trojan lyre or the Mongol drum, these sounds weren't accidents of history. They were deliberate, calculated strategies, proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that breaks walls, but the one that shapes the hearts and minds of those behind them. The next time you hear an old folk song or a marching band, listen closer. That melody might carry echoes of sieges long past, when notes were as decisive as blades. The Roman legions didn't just march to the beat of drums, they moved to the precision of a metronome. Every trumpet blast, every rhythmic cadence served a singular purpose: absolute control. Their music wasn't about artistry, it was a language of war stripped down to its most efficient form. A short, staccato call from the cornison might signal centuries to wheel left, while a sustained note from the tubison could halt an entire cohort mid-charge. This wasn't just communication, it was the auditory glue that held Rome's war machine together. Contrast that with the Huns, whose riders swept across the steppes in a tempest of noise. Their strategy wasn't order but overload, a cacophony of screeching whistles, rattling horse tack, and guttural war cries designed to drown out rational thought. Where the Romans sought clarity, the Huns weaponized confusion, knowing that a mind overwhelmed by sound couldn't strategize. In feudal Japan, the samurai's relationship with sound was almost meditative. Before battle, flute players would perform solemn melodies called dojio bushi, their reedy tones cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. This wasn't mere tradition, it was mental conditioning. The flute's piercing notes forced warriors to focus, their breath syncing with the music to steady trembling hands. For the samurai, discipline wasn't just physical. It was auditory, a practice of filtering out chaos until only the present moment remained. Meanwhile, on the misty hills of ancient Britain, Celtic warriors took the opposite approach. Their Carnix's twisted brass horns ending in snarling animal heads weren't instruments so much as psychological artillery. When blown in unison, their dissonant wails created a wall of sound so visceral, Roman historians claimed it could turn a man's bowels to water. The Celts understood something primal. Sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a melody but a scream. These differences weren't arbitrary, they were reflections of each culture's very soul. The Romans, builders of roads and aqueducts, saw music as another tool to impose structure on chaos. The Huns, born of the wind-swept plains, used sound like the storms they revered, wild, untamed, and utterly unpredictable. For the samurai, whose code demanded perfection, flute music was a mirror revealing the clarity or clutter of a warrior's mind, and the Celts, with their deep connection to nature, crafted instruments that didn't just mimic animal cries but channeled their ferocity. Even the silences spoke volumes. A Roman legion falling quiet signaled imminent discipline, a trap about to spring. But when the Huns suddenly ceased their clamor, it often meant they'd already struck, vanishing like ghosts into the grasslands. The samurai's pauses between flute notes were as deliberate as the spaces between sword strokes, while Celtic warriors might drop their carnixes mid-blast to unleash a deafening chorus of shouts, weaponizing the contrast between noise and its absence. What's astonishing is how these ancient tactics still resonate. Modern military drills echo Rome's obsession with rhythmic commands, while psychological operations borrow from the Huns' playbook of sensory overload. Elite athletes use focused soundscapes reminiscent of the samurai's flutes, and crowd control techniques employ dissonance straight from the Celtic arsenal. The instruments have changed, but the principles endure. Sound isn't just something we hear, it's something we feel, something that bypasses logic to speak directly to our instincts. So the next time you hear music, ask yourself, is it art or is it war? History whispers that the line between them was never as clear as we think. History often paints war music as the domain of men, deep-voiced chanters and broad-shouldered drummers, but that's only half the story. Celtic women stood on the edges of battlefields, their voices rising above the clash of steel in haunting harmonies. These weren't mere spectators, their chants were weapons, designed to stir courage in their warriors and unease in the enemy. Ancient texts describe how their songs could turn the tide of a skirmish, not with blades but with the sheer force of sound. Imagine the scene, a wall of shields trembling under enemy assault, then suddenly steadying as the women's voices cut through the chaos, reminding the fighters exactly what and who they were defending. Half a world away, the Dahomey Amazons of West Africa took this concept even further. These legendary female warriors didn't just support battles with music, they led them. Their regiments marched to the rhythm of iron bells and wooden drums, the beats syncing with their footsteps to create an almost hypnotic effect. To opposing forces, the sight and sound of these women singing, dancing, and advancing in perfect unison wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. European colonizers wrote of the Amazons' war songs as the sound of inevitability, a psychological barrage that made their military prowess seem supernatural. Even in cultures where women were barred from combat, their voices shaped warfare. In ancient Sparta, mothers and wives would gather to sing solemn hymns as their men marched off to battle. These weren't tearful farewells but stark reminders of duty, lyrics praising glory and shaming cowardice. The message was clear: return with your shield or on it. The power of these songs lay in their simplicity. A single line, repeated by hundreds of women, could echo in a soldier's mind long after the battle began, stiffening his resolve when fear threatened to take hold. But perhaps the most overlooked role belonged to the musicians hidden in plain sight, enslaved women forced to play for their captors' armies. Roman historians casually mention servant girls who maintained the legion's instruments, tuned their lyres, and even composed marching songs. Their contributions were erased by history, yet without them, the very music that held Rome's legions together might have faltered. The same pattern repeats across empires, anonymous women weaving the sonic fabric of war, their labor as essential as it was invisible. What's striking is how these traditions reflect a universal truth: sound has no gender. A drumbeat doesn't care who strikes it. A battle cry isn't weaker for rising from a woman's throat. Yet for centuries, historians sidelined these stories, preferring tales of male heroism. Today, as we rediscover these voices, we're reminded that war music was never a solo. It was a chorus, and women were always part of the refrain. Their legacy hums beneath the surface of every epic battle chant, waiting to be heard again. When the gates closed and the siege began, defenders didn't just hunker down in silence, they fought back with songs. Take the castle garrisons of medieval Europe, where soldiers would gather in courtyards not just to sharpen swords, but to raise their voices in unison. These weren't random tunes, they were carefully chosen anthems, often rooted in local folklore or religious hymns, designed to stitch fraying nerves back together. A Welsh chronicle from the 12th century describes besieged knights singing ballads about past victories, their voices echoing off stone walls as if to remind themselves, and the enemy outside, that these walls had never fallen. The effect was psychological armor. Singing together created a sense of unity that hunger and fatigue couldn't easily break, turning individual fear into collective defiance. But defenders didn't stop at morale boosting, they weaponized sound to disrupt attackers' plans. During the siege of Antioch, crusaders reported an eerie tactic. The city's Muslim defenders blared horns and clashed cymbals at random intervals, drowning out the invaders' drum signals. Without those rhythmic cues, crusader assaults lost coordination, their siege towers and ladders advancing out of sync. It was acoustic guerrilla warfare, turning the attackers' own tactics against them. The Byzantines refined this even further, using their massive church bells not just for worship, but as a city-wide alarm system. The deep, resonant toll of a particular bell might warn of an approaching army, while a faster, sharper peal could signal fires or breaches. To the untrained ear, it was just noise. To the citizens, it was a lifeline. Some cities took creativity to new heights. During a siege in Renaissance Italy, defenders suspended metal sheets from the ramparts and struck them with hammers, creating a piercing, discordant clang that disrupted enemy communication. Others recorded instances of defenders mimicking the attackers' trumpet calls, sending false signals to sow confusion. Imagine the chaos when a unit charging toward what they thought was an agreed-upon rally point instead found themselves alone under a hail of arrows. The most poignant use of music, though, wasn't about deception or disruption, it was about dignity. In Constantinople's final hours before falling to the Ottomans, survivors wrote of priests moving through the streets chanting hymns, their voices steady even as the walls crumbled. That decision to meet catastrophe with song wasn't just piety, it was a final act of resistance, proof that even in defeat, some weapons could never be silenced. Today, traces of these strategies linger in emergency sirens and military bugle calls, reminders that sound has always been a two-way street in warfare. For every army pounding drums outside the gates, there were voices on the walls answering back not with steel, but with something far harder to break, spirit. The thunder of cannons didn't just shatter castle walls, it silenced an entire tradition of warfare. As gunpowder reshaped battlefields in the 16th and 17th centuries, the once vital role of war music began to fade. Drums and trumpets, tools that had directed armies for millennia, couldn't compete with the roar of artillery or the crackle of musket volleys. Why signal with a horn when a cannon's blast could be heard for miles? The age of industrialized warfare prized speed and precision over psychological theatrics, leaving little room for the rhythmic rituals of old. Yet even as armies modernized, music never fully retreated. It adapted, clinging to the edges of combat like a ghost refusing to fade. The shift wasn't immediate. Early gunpowder armies still marched to drumbeats, their formations too tight to abandon auditory commands. But as battlefields expanded and firearms grew louder, the old methods became dangerously impractical. During the Napoleonic Wars, commanders found their carefully rehearsed trumpet calls drowned out by the chaos of cannon fire. A single misheard note could send regiments charging into slaughter. By the American Civil War, brass bands still played to rally troops, but now they did so from safer distances, their melodies drifting over carnage they were no longer designed to control. The music remained, but its function had changed, less a weapon, more a morale booster for weary soldiers. Yet in the trenches of World War I, echoes of ancient sonic warfare resurfaced in unexpected ways. Officers blew whistles to signal charges, their piercing shrieks cutting through the din of machine guns, a grim callback to the Roman tubas' battlefield commands. Some units even revived drummers, not to set marching paces, but to maintain rhythm during nighttime trench repairs, their soft taps guiding men through the mud like miners following a canary's song. And then there were the spontaneous moments, like the Christmas truce of 1914, when German and British soldiers temporarily laid down arms to sing carols across no man's land. For a few hushed hours, music became what it had been for the Celts or the Spartans, a bridge between enemies, a fleeting reminder of shared humanity. World War II saw even more poignant vestiges. Scottish bagpipers led charges across Normandy's beaches, their drones audible even over naval bombardments. Japanese forces used eerie flute melodies to coordinate nighttime movements in the Pacific jungles, their sound camouflaged by nature's chorus. Even the Nazis, with their chilling orchestration of propaganda, understood music's power, though they twisted it into something far darker than the Assyrians or Mongols could have imagined. By then, radios and machine guns had rendered musical commands obsolete, but the instinct remained. Sound still shaped how soldiers fought, feared, and endured. Today, remnants linger in boot camp cadences and the bugle calls of military funerals. Modern drones can project sound over battlefields with terrifying precision, a high-tech echo of the Mongols' phantom drummers. And psychologists study how certain frequencies can disorient or calm, proving that ancient commanders were onto something science now confirms. The instruments have changed, but the principle endures. War isn't just fought with steel and fire. It's waged in the mind, where a well-timed note can still stir courage or unravel resolve. The golden age of war music may be past, but its echoes whisper through every conflict, reminding us that silence was never war's natural state, only its rarest weapon. The roar of heavy metal music blasting from U.S. Army loudspeakers during the invasion of Panama in 1989 wasn't just a bizarre footnote, it was the latest chapter in an ancient story. For 72 straight hours, American forces bombarded Manuel Noriega's hideout with deafening playlists of rock and opera, a sonic siege designed to break his resolve without firing a shot. The tactic worked. Within days, the dictator emerged dazed and defeated, proving that even in the age of stealth bombers and satellite surveillance, sound remains one of warfare's most potent weapons. The instruments have changed, but the psychology hasn't. Just as Mongol drums once rattled city walls, modern armies now wield subwoofers and ultrasonic emitters to unsettle, disorient, and dominate. Take the LRAD long-range acoustic device, a futuristic descendant of the Celtic Carnix. This directional sound cannon can project ear-splitting tones with surgical precision, turning protest crowds into retreating mobs without a single baton swing. Police forces from Ferguson to Hong Kong have deployed these sonic weapons, harnessing the same primal instincts ancient commanders exploited, the human brain's hardwired panic response to certain frequencies. Meanwhile, at black sites halfway across the globe, interrogators use white noise and repetitive music to erode detainees' sense of time, a high-tech twist on the Assyrians' sleep deprivation tactics. The goal isn't just discomfort, it's to fracture the mind's defenses, just as siege drums once wore down fortress garrisons. But the battlefield isn't the only place where these ancient principles thrive. Protest movements from the civil rights era to today's global demonstrations have turned freedom songs into shields. When Chilean students faced down Pinochet's riot police with orchestrated chanting, or when Ukrainian crowds sang their national anthem before Russian tanks, they weren't just making noise, they were forging unity through rhythm, much like Viking shield walls syncing their steps to war drums. Even ISIS weaponized sound in their propaganda videos, pairing footage of atrocities with hypnotic nasheeds to desensitize recruits. Everywhere you look, from TikTok activism to corporate team-building chants, groups still use music to bind people together or tear them apart. The most haunting parallel lies in modern soundscapes of occupation. Palestinian families describe Israeli drones hovering overhead for hours, their incessant buzzing designed to grind down resistance through psychological attrition, a drone-age version of the Mongol sleepless drum sieges. In Kashmir, military checkpoints blast Bollywood music at deafening volumes, not for entertainment but as auditory domination, asserting control over public space through sheer noise pollution. These aren't random cruelties, they're calculated applications of an age-old truth. Whoever controls the soundscape controls the narrative. Perhaps the ultimate irony is how these military sound strategies have bled into civilian life. Shopping malls use carefully curated playlists to influence spending habits, while employers pipe in white noise to boost productivity, both leveraging the same neurological triggers ancient generals exploited. Even the eerie silence of noise-canceling headphones echoes warfare's oldest trick, the power of sudden quiet to unsettle. The next time you find yourself soothed by a song or startled by an alarm, remember, you're experiencing the same primal responses that once decided the fate of empires. The battleground has expanded from castle walls to earbuds, but the war for your attention through sound never really ended. Buried in peat bogs and etched onto crumbling temple walls, the physical remnants of ancient war music tell a fractured but fascinating story. That Celtic Carnix discovered in Scotland's Deskford Bog, its bronze boar's head still snarling after 2,000 years, wasn't just ceremonial. When experimental archaeologists reconstructed it, the resulting blast wasn't musical at all. It was a visceral, shrieking wail that echoed across valleys, exactly as Roman historians described. The sound of demons loosed upon the earth. Nearby, a dozen more Carnix fragments lay scattered, suggesting whole regiments of these instruments once marched into battle, their collective roar engineered to overwhelm. Half a world away, Assyrian palace reliefs depict something equally deliberate: massive, wheeled drum carts pulled by oxen, each drum wider than a man is tall. Modern acousticians calculate that such instruments could produce frequencies below 20 Hz, the threshold of human hearing. You wouldn't just hear those drums, you'd feel them in your ribcage, a physical presence as inescapable as the army they heralded. At the British Museum's replica, visitors report an uncanny sensation. The sound doesn't fade like normal noise but lingers in the body like distant thunder, proof that these weren't instruments but psychological artillery. The real breakthroughs come when archaeologists cross-reference these finds with battlefield terrain. At the site of Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes ambushed Roman legions, soil analysis revealed unusual concentrations of bronze fragments, not from weapons but from shattered Litu's horns. Their placement suggests Germanic musicians positioned themselves at key elevation points, using the landscape as a natural amplifier to create the illusion of surrounding forces. This wasn't primitive noise-making. It was acoustic warfare, leveraging geology as carefully as any modern sound engineer shapes stadium acoustics. Perhaps most haunting are the silent survivors, like the Scythian mouth plates found in Ukrainian kurgans. These golden dental overlays, etched with intricate patterns, weren't just adornments. Worn by elite warriors, they transformed the wearer's battle cries into metallic, inhuman shrieks. Paired with surviving descriptions of Scythian choirs of the damned, they hint at a lost tradition of vocal distortion, turning the human voice into something unrecognizable and terrifying. Experimental archaeology bridges these fragments into chilling reality. When Cambridge researchers played reconstructed Assyrian drum patterns inside a replica siege tunnel, the vibrations destabilized the walls at precise resonant frequencies. Suddenly, ancient accounts of singing sappers collapsing enemy tunnels make gruesome sense. Similarly, the University of Huddersfield's Soundgate project proved that Greek theatre acoustics designed to carry whispers could also amplify war flutes to psychologically devastating effect over siege distances. These artifacts do more than prove war music existed, they reveal its sophistication. That Celtic horn wasn't randomly shaped, its bell's curvature focuses sound like a laser. Those Assyrian drums weren't haphazardly sized, their dimensions create standing waves that disorient. Every surviving fragment whispers the same truth. Ancient musicians didn't just accompany war. They engineered it. The reconstructed cry of a Celtic Carnix shatters the quiet of a modern field, its bronze boar's head twisting the air into a scream that hasn't been heard in battle for 2,000 years. This isn't just historical curiosity, it's a sonic time machine transporting us back to an era when music was warfare by other means. Groups like Carnix and Co. didn't just rebuild these instruments from ancient fragments, they brought them roaring back to life, proving with each blast how a single horn could dominate the chaos of a battlefield. The first time modern ears hear that sound at full volume, the reaction is always the same: visceral shock. What museum displays can't convey is how the Carnix's call doesn't just travel through the air, it slices through it, a metallic wail that lingers in the bones long after the note fades. Experimental archaeologists have turned these reconstructions into revelation machines. By studying the exact alloys and dimensions of surviving horn fragments, they've recreated instruments capable of projecting over 90 decibels louder than a lawnmower across distances exceeding 300 meters. That's not just audible, it's inescapable. When played in formation, as they would have been by Celtic warriors, the effect is chilling. The overlapping tones create dissonance that modern psychoacoustics confirms triggers unease, a primal response our ancestors weaponized instinctively. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh discovered something even more startling. The Carnix's unique shape acts as a natural amplifier, its elongated bell focusing sound waves into a narrow beam like an ancient bullhorn. This wasn't just noise, it was precision engineering. But the real magic happens when these instruments return to their original contexts. At the site of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where Germanic tribes annihilated Roman legions, reenactors positioned reconstructed litus horns along the forest's natural echo points. The result, a single player could create the illusion of multiple horn sections, their calls bouncing off the trees in a disorienting chorus. Suddenly, Roman accounts of being surrounded by unseen demons make horrifying sense. Similarly, when Assyrian drum reconstructions were tested in replica siege tunnels, their low-frequency pulses didn't just rattle the walls, they triggered vibrations at the exact resonant frequency to destabilize the structure. Ancient engineers didn't just dig tunnels, they turned them into sound chambers, collapsing enemy defenses with rhythm as much as picks. Modern musicians delving into these traditions face unexpected challenges. Playing a Carnix isn't like blowing a trumpet. It requires a technique closer to Mongolian throat singing, forcing air through clenched teeth to produce its signature rasp. The physical toll is immense. Seasoned brass players report jaw fatigue after just minutes of performance. That's revealing in itself. These weren't instruments designed for leisure. They were tools of endurance meant to be played until lips bled and voices broke. The same goes for reconstructed Roman tubas, which demand lung capacity exceeding modern orchestral instruments. When reenactors march 30 miles in full kit while maintaining precise trumpet calls, as Roman musicians would have, it becomes clear ancient war music wasn't an art form, it was an extreme sport. What's even more fascinating is how these reconstructions are rewriting history. For decades, scholars assumed the eerie tintinnabulum described in Roman texts was a poetic metaphor until a team in Austria built one based on temple carvings. This rack of small bronze bells, when shaken during battle reenactments, produces a high-pitched shimmer that cuts through lower frequencies like a knife. Paired with the grunts of combat and clang of steel, the effect is unnervingly similar to descriptions of the gods laughing in battle. Similarly, the discovery that Viking war drums were likely played with bone mallets instead of wood explains why Norse sagas describe their beat as the rattle of the dead. Every accurate reconstruction peels back another layer of myth, revealing the sophisticated acoustic warfare hiding beneath. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the reactions of modern audiences. When Carnix and Co. performed at a Scottish Highland Games, attendees described an almost physical pressure in their chests as the horns played. The same infrasound effect Assyrian drummers exploited millennia ago. At a reenactment of Roman siege maneuvers in Germany, spectators instinctively backed away from the reconstructed cornus blasts, their bodies reacting faster than their minds could rationalize. This isn't just academic play acting, it's proof that our nervous systems still respond to these ancient sounds exactly as intended. The Carnix's scream, the drum's thunder, the trumpet's piercing cry, they bypass centuries of evolution to speak directly to something primal within us. When those notes ring out across a field today, they're not echoes of the past. For a fleeting moment, they are the past, alive and vibrating in the air around us. The mournful notes of taps drifting across Arlington National Cemetery carry more than just melody. They echo across centuries of warfare. This 24-note bugle call, now synonymous with military funerals, traces its roots directly to the battlefield signals of the American Civil War, which themselves descended from European trumpet commands dating back to the Crusades. When that lone bugle sounds today, it isn't just honoring the fallen, it's whispering the last secret of ancient sonic warfare. That music never truly leaves combat, even when the swords and shields are gone. Bagpipes tell a similar story. The skirl of the Highland Regiment's pipes didn't start as ceremonial, it was psychological artillery. During the Jacobite uprisings, the sound of massed pipes approaching at dawn could send enemy forces into retreat before a single shot was fired. The instrument's unique acoustics, with drones that create dissonant harmonics, trigger the same unease in modern listeners as they did in 18th century battlefields. That's why pipers still lead parades in full ceremonial dress. The tradition isn't just about pageantry. Every step honors an era when the piper's role was as dangerous as any frontline soldiers. Historical records show pipers had mortality rates rivaling officers during World War I, their silhouettes making them prime targets as they played troops over the top of trenches. Drumlines reveal even deeper connections. The precision cadences performed by the U.S. Army's Old Guard or Britain's Coldstream Guards aren't just for show. They're direct descendants of the field drums that once relayed orders across noisy battlefields. Watch closely during the changing of the guard, and you'll spot subtle cues in the rhythms. A flam paradiddle that might have signaled form ranks in Napoleon's army, or a rolling press that once warned of cavalry approaching. These patterns survived not because they're musical, but because they're muscle memory ingrained through generations of soldiers who lived and died by their meaning. Even seemingly modern traditions have ancient DNA. The U.S. Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon, with their rifle-twirling routines performed without verbal commands, mirrors the Roman legion's signiferum drills, where standard-bearers used flag motions to direct troops when trumpets couldn't be heard. The elaborate shout-step routines of South Korean honor guards, they're rooted in Silla dynasty war dances meant to synchronize warriors' movements through sound and vibration. Everywhere you look, ceremonial flourishes hide combat necessities frozen in time. The most poignant survivals are the ones that outlasted their original purpose. The Swiss Army still maintains a corps of alpine horn players, though their 6-foot wooden instruments once warned of invaders crossing mountain passes. The French Republican Guard's mounted trumpet corps still practices signals last used at Waterloo. These aren't just quaint traditions, they're living archaeology, preserving sonic tactics that once decided empires. When the Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace stomps their boots in unison during inspection, that thunderous crack isn't just disciplinary. It's the ghost of Roman legionaries clashing their scooter together to intimidate foes. What's remarkable is how these sounds still trigger instinctive responses. Scientists measuring brain waves during military ceremonies found that drum cadences increase focus and alertness, the same physiological effects ancient commanders sought on battlefields. Bagpipe drones activate the amygdala's threat detection, just as they unsettled Highland enemies centuries ago. Even the deliberate pauses in bugle calls exploit auditory processing patterns that help troops distinguish commands amid chaos. The uniforms and weapons have modernized, but our nervous systems still react to these sounds as our ancestors did, proof that military music's power was never just cultural, but biological. So the next time you hear a veteran's funeral played with a single bugle, or see a drummer's sticks flash in perfect time, remember, you're not just witnessing tradition. You're hearing the last survivors of an ancient arsenal, notes that once held the power to rally armies, shatter walls, and bend the course of history. The battlefields fell silent long ago, but their music plays on. Those ancient war drums and blaring horns weren't just relics of forgotten battlefields. They were early experiments in a science we're still mastering today, the art of influencing human behavior through sound. The same primal instincts that made Celtic warriors shudder at the Carnix's wail now make social media algorithms prioritize videos with startling audio spikes. Our brains still process sound as a survival tool, reacting to certain frequencies and rhythms before logic can intervene. Modern advertisers and political strategists exploit this daily, using sudden jingles or ominous bass tones to trigger attention or anxiety, mirroring how Assyrian drummers once used infrasound to unsettle besieged cities. The battlefield has simply shifted from castle walls to smartphone screens. Consider the eerie parallels between ancient sonic sieges and today's digital warfare. The Mongol tactic of relentless nighttime drumming to deprive enemies of sleep finds its counterpart in 24/7 news cycles and endless notification pings, both designed to exhaust mental defenses. Viral misinformation spreads like those echoing horn blasts across medieval valleys, where the sheer repetition of a false claim, like the repeated beat of a drum, can make it feel true through sheer persistence. Even the Viking practice of synchronizing shield strikes to create overwhelming noise resurfaces in online cancel culture, where the coordinated amplification of outrage can drown out nuance. The tools have evolved, but the psychology remains unchanged. Overwhelm the senses and you control the narrative. Yet there's hope in these historical echoes. Just as besieged cities used counter-songs to rally morale, modern movements harness music to unite against oppression. The protest anthems of the civil rights era, the viral solidarity chants during Ukraine's resistance, these are the spiritual descendants of defiant castle choirs singing over enemy drumbeats. Neuroscientists confirm what ancient commanders knew instinctively. Synchronized singing or chanting releases oxytocin, bonding strangers into a cohesive group faster than any speech. Activists from Hong Kong to Belarus have revived this ancient wisdom, using rhythm to turn scattered crowds into unbreakable formations. Perhaps the most urgent lesson lies in recognizing manipulation. When you notice a viral video's background score swelling at just the right moment to provoke anger or tears, you're hearing the ghost of Roman trumpets dictating emotional responses on command. The dissonant chords in horror movie soundtracks, they're the cinematic descendants of Celtic war horns, exploiting the same neural pathways that once warned our ancestors of predators. Awareness is our new city wall, understanding that every ping, ringtone, and autoplay video is part of a sonic arsenal vying for your attention, your fear, or your allegiance. The next time you feel your pulse quicken from a sudden alert or catch yourself humming a propaganda jingle turned meme, remember, you're not just reacting to sound. You're experiencing the latest skirmish in an eternal war for the mind, where the weapons are notes and silence, and the battlefield is the space between your ears. Those ancient commanders would recognize the playbook instantly. They wrote its first chapters. The story of Jericho's walls tumbling from trumpet blasts is one of history's most enduring legends, but archaeology tells a different tale. Excavations at the ancient city reveal walls that did indeed collapse, yet not from divine intervention or musical resonance. The real culprit, earthquake activity common to the region, with telltale layers of crushed bricks and tilted foundations. So why the trumpet myth? Because sound played a different, equally powerful role: coordination. Priests circling the city with ram's horns weren't trying to summon miracles. They were marking time, their blasts synchronizing sappers to undermine the walls at precise intervals. The collapse wasn't magical, it was meticulously engineered, with music as the metronome of destruction. Then there's the legend of Alexander the Great's phantom army, said to have deceived enemies with echoing horns. While the tactic was real, the supernatural spin obscures its brilliance. Macedonian musicians didn't conjure ghosts, they exploited acoustics. By spacing brass players across rocky gorges, they created overlapping echoes that mimicked reinforcements. This wasn't sorcery, it was physics, leveraging natural sound reflection to multiply their perceived numbers. Similar exaggerations plagued tales of hypnotic Spartan flutes. Ancient sources describe their melodies as disciplined, not mind-controlling. The truth is subtler. The Spartans used repetitive, trance-like rhythms to induce focused states in warriors, much like modern athletes use pump-up playlists. The effect wasn't enchantment, it was neurobiology harnessing rhythm's power to steady hands and quiet doubt. One of the most debunked yet persistent myths involves the piercing flutes of Attila, said to paralyze foes with ultrasonic frequencies. Forensic musicology confirms Hunnic instruments couldn't produce such tones, but their actual use was far more cunning. Survivors' accounts describe shrieking whistles tied to arrows, creating a chorus of descending cries as volleys arced overhead. This wasn't sonic weaponry, it was psychological theater, transforming ordinary projectiles into a terrifying auditory spectacle. Likewise, Viking war drums weren't the massive, mythic instruments of fantasy. Archaeological finds reveal small, handheld frame drums, but their true power lay in rhythm, not size. By striking them in sync with oar strokes during river raids, Vikings made their longships seem to glide unnaturally fast, as if propelled by occult forces. Separating fact from legend reveals a fascinating pattern. Ancient commanders didn't need magic to make music formidable. They understood human perception. When Roman historians wrote of Germanic war, chants summoning forest demons, they were describing deliberate vocal distortion, guttural growls amplified by metal mouthpieces found in graves. The Aztec death whistles that terrified conquistadors didn't channel spirits. They mimicked human screams in precise harmonics known to trigger panic responses. Even the silent marches of ninja weren't about absolute quiet, but about masking normal sounds with ambient noise like waterfalls or wind chimes. These debunked myths share a common thread. They reduce sophisticated acoustic warfare to simplistic magic. The reality demands more respect. Without microphones or decibel meters, ancient cultures engineered soundscapes with the precision of modern psychological operations. Their tricks weren't crude deceptions but masterclasses in human cognition, leveraging everything from echo physics to neural priming. The next time you hear an ancient war myth, listen past the fantastical veneer. Beneath it, you'll uncover something even more remarkable: the ingenuity of minds who weaponized sound centuries before science could explain why it worked. Their music didn't need magic to move mountains. It moved something far harder to sway: the human mind. Close your eyes and imagine the weight of a stone wall at your back, the scent of torch smoke sharp in your nose. For the seventh night in a row, the enemy's drums pulse through the darkness, not the erratic beats of musicians, but the slow, deliberate rhythm of a predator circling its prey. Each thud vibrates through your boots, syncing with your heartbeat until you can't tell which is which. Your fingers cramp around your spear as laughter echoes from the camp below. They're not attacking, not yet. They're letting the sound do the work for them. This was the reality of sonic siegecraft, a battle fought not just with weapons, but with the very air you breathe. Modern psychology confirms what ancient defenders knew instinctively: unpredictable noise is torture. Sleep deprivation sets in first, turning thoughts sluggish. Then comes hypervigilance. Every rustle of wind or scurry of rats becomes an impending attack. By the third night without rest, hallucinations creep in. That's when the real weapon reveals itself: time. Unlike a frontal assault with clear beginnings and ends, a sonic siege had no expiration date. It could last weeks, months, until the defenders broke from within. Now picture your countermove. Do you order your own musicians to play louder, drowning out the enemy? Risky. That burns precious calories besieged troops can't spare. Maybe you mimic their rhythms, creating false signals to confuse them. Or perhaps you weaponize silence, suddenly cutting off all noise from your walls to make the enemy question if you've abandoned your posts or worse, prepared a trap. History shows defenders got creative. During the Siege of Leyden in 1574, the Dutch flooded their own lands rather than endure another night of Spanish drumbeats. At Malta in 1565, knights scattered sheep bells in no man's land to mask Ottoman tunneling sounds. Desperation bred ingenuity, but the cruelest twist. Adaptation. Just as your ears adjust to the drums, they stop. For hours, nothing but crickets chirp beyond the walls. Is it a trick, a prelude to attack? Your sentries squint into the blackness, straining for movement. Then, without warning, a single horn shrieks, jolting the entire garrison awake. This was the true mastery of ancient sonic warfare. It didn't just harm the body. It rewired the mind, turning anticipation into a weapon sharper than any arrow. The experience leaves traces even today. Ever jolted awake at a distant siren or felt your stomach clench during a suspenseful movie score? Those reactions are living fossils, remnants of when our ancestors' survival depended on reading sound cues. Next time you hear a rhythmic noise you can't control, construction drills, a neighbor's bass, even a ticking clock, notice how irritation blooms into helplessness. That flicker of frustration is the faintest echo of what defenders endured night after night, when music wasn't art but a siege engine for the mind. From the drumbeats that shook the walls of Jericho to the eerie silence of Spartan advances, sound has carved its mark on history's battlefields, not as a mere backdrop but as a decisive force. Consider this: while swords rust and arrows splinter, the echoes of war music linger, woven into the fabric of cultures long after the battles fade. The Mongol horns that once sent villages fleeing now inspire film scores, their dissonance still triggering that same primal unease. The Roman tuba's piercing blasts live on in the bugle calls of modern armies, a thread connecting legionaries to today's soldiers. Even the Celtic Carnix's scream, reconstructed from ancient fragments, still chills listeners with its raw, metallic wail, proof that these sounds weren't just tools but timeless weapons. But the true legacy of war music isn't just in its survival, it's in its transformation. The same frequencies that once destabilized siege tunnels now pulse through concert speakers, manipulating crowds at rallies and protests. The rhythmic discipline of Roman drummers finds new life in the cadences of boot camp drills, where recruits learn to move as one to the beat of shouted chants. And that unsettling infrasound the Assyrians weaponized, it's the secret behind horror movie soundtracks, tweaking our nerves with vibrations we feel more than hear. The battlefield didn't abandon music, it simply disguised it in new forms. What's haunting is how little our reactions have changed. When protesters in Kiev sang their national anthem before advancing tanks, they tapped into the same defiant energy as medieval defenders chanting from castle walls. The blaring sirens of air raids trigger the same adrenal response as Aztec death whistles did 5 centuries ago. Even the silence between notes, that ancient Spartan trick, still unsettles us, exploited by filmmakers and military tacticians alike. The instruments evolve, but the human nervous system remains stubbornly, vulnerably the same. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. The next time a viral video uses a crescendo to manipulate your emotions, or a store's playlist nudges you to linger longer, you're experiencing the same principles ancient commanders wielded. The soundscape of modern life, from alarm tones to elevator music, is a battlefield where attention is the prize. Recognizing these tactics is our best defense. So when you hit play on your favorite song today, take a moment to listen deeper. Beneath the melody, you might just hear the whisper of war drums, reminding us that sound never stopped being power. If this journey through history's sonic warfare resonated with you, let us know. What melody would you wield on the battlefield? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories. The past isn't silent, it's waiting.